Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
The British Museum, the Gherkin, Hearst Tower. Norman Foster is responsible for some of the most recognizable buildings around the world. But architecture is about more than just wood, steel, and concrete. It's about the way that we use space and we interact with our environment. And for Foster, sustainability and energy-efficient techniques are built into his process. So from Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, one of the world's most sustainable office buildings, which Norman Foster designed, I spoke to the veteran British architect about where it all began.
From the birth of the present practice, which goes back to the 1960s, and arguably the emergence of the Green Movement, although it wasn't called the Green Movement at that time. But you had writers, you had philosophers across many disciplines, probably coincident with the with journeys into space and viewing the planet Earth, or Spaceship Earth, as Buckminster Fuller coined it.
But what about the industry now? How do architects now evolve to make sure that they are putting green at the very core of their buildings and designs?
Buildings are important, obviously, but it's not just buildings and a holistic approach. It's the infrastructure. It's the transport between the buildings. Think of the infrastructure as the urban glue which binds the buildings together. The highways, the bridges, the ports, the boulevards, the piazzas, the bigger picture. That is really the identity of the city beyond the architecture of an individual building. If you think holistically, then you have to break down the barriers between different disciplines and responsibilities. Think of those who take care of the energy in a system, in a city, and those who take care of the waste. If you're thinking holistically, should be converting the waste into energy in a move towards a more circular economy.
Has building sustainably has it ever been a burden?
I would argue to the contrary, that that architecture is really very much about constraints and turning constraints to advantage. And in that sense, I'd say that it was an incentive, it was a stimulant, it was inspirational.
When you're thinking about the future, I know you just don't think about buildings, you think about cities and communities, but buildings can be self-powered. At the same time, I think of the Texas grid that recently shut down. How do you do both? How do you make buildings in themselves sustainable and self-reliant, but at the same time still being communal?
I think the example of Texas and the grid is very pertinent, and I think it is long overdue to question the nature of the big grid. In so many other fields, communication, you look at the development, information technology, we have moved away from big centralized systems. We no longer have telephone exchanges with thousands of people and wires going across the countryside. It's autonomous, and the same possibilities exist in terms of energy. There have been huge advances in nuclear, and the potential for miniaturized nuclear reactors, which can be the size of a container, 20 feet long, which can power an entire Manhattan city block or a community of more than 20,000. So being independent of the big grid, which is hugely wasteful.
What about retrofitting buildings sustainably? Is that a solution, and should that be a policy?
I think there's a powerful incentive to recycle a building, to create new buildings with an eye to the future. In that sense, as an architect, you design today with an awareness of the past for the needs of the present, but for a future which is unknown. So buildings which can adapt over time are obviously more sustainable. To recycle a building is better than demolishing it and starting again. But you will always have new buildings. You will always have buildings which, either by virtue of their historic significance, play a continuing role, they have a symbolic role, and therefore there is an onus to extend their life. I could give you examples of buildings like the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Tower, which, because it rethought the very nature of a tall building, it took the central core, traditionally at the heart of the floors, broke that down, moved it to the edge. So the floors were unbroken, front to back. You could see from one side to the other. That bank was able to incorporate a dealer's floor, unheard of in a bank headquarters.
When you think of buildings, and even in your sense, infrastructure, so much of the material is notoriously difficult to decarbonize. You think of steel, you think of concrete. These are very problematic. What kind of materials have you been working with that are just a bit more sustainable?
Well, obviously, wood is more sustainable. The building that we're exchanging now, the building that I'm in, is a totally wooden building. But again, it's difficult to generalize. If you take steel which has come out of a clean grid is very different in terms of its carbon content from steel which has come out of a dirty grid powered by fossil fuels, for example.
Coming up, we speak to the pioneers of Europe's new Bauhaus, plus Japan's earthquake-proof skyscrapers, how it's using AI and traditional techniques to future-proof its cities. This is Bloomberg Green. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. From heat waves to hurricanes, extreme weather events have increased dramatically over the last 20 years, and it's bound to only get worse. More than 7,000 extreme events were recorded between 2000 and 2019, totaling more than $3 trillion in economic damage. So we looked into how one of the most exposed countries is using traditional techniques to disaster-proof their buildings.
The ground began to shake. 32 million people here in Tokyo braced themselves for the worst.
8.9 magnitude. Now we know that's a big number. It was the fifth largest earthquake in history.
But the real damage comes from the ferocious tsunami that was unleashed.
Japan is located in the Pacific earthquake belt. This means the country is struck by some of the strongest earthquakes and tsunamis in the world. But learning from painful experience, Japan has built one of the world's best natural disaster response systems, which includes regular disaster preparedness drills and early warning alerts. Japanese engineers and architects have also pushed the boundaries of technology and design to create resilient, disaster-proof buildings. This is Tokyo Skytree. At 634 meters, it's the world's tallest tower. Designed for broadcasting and observation, the base of Skytree occupies a relatively small plot of land that isn't ideal for such a tall structure.
デザイナーとしては非常に緊張感のある細長い構造物になって、地震もそうなんですけれども、風が一番厳しい自然条件になります。
Atsuo Konishi and his colleagues designed a steel truss tower, so instead of fighting against the wind, it can simply pass through the gaps between the trusses.
これは逆に普通のビルで採用しているいろんなデバイスだとか制震の方法が細くて高いこのビルに使えなかったので、このタワーの揺れを抑えるためにはどうしたらいいだろうとずっといろいろ知恵を絞っていった中で生み出されたので、そういう意味で他にないユニークなものになったのではないかなというふうに思っています。
To stabilize the tower, the team used a traditional Japanese design called shimbashira that dates back over 1,000 years. This is the flexible central pillar of a Japanese pagoda, which stabilizes the tiered wooden structure during an earthquake or typhoon, in a similar way to a tree trunk supporting its branches. For Skytree, the team designed a 375-metre-tall concrete core column connected to the tower's steel outer frame by a series of flexible oil dampers, devices that control unwanted vibrations. The swaying of the core column and outer frame in opposite directions reduced the vibration of the entire tower by up to 50% during an earthquake and 30% during strong winds. When Skytree was designed in the late 2000s, architects and engineers flew weather balloons to collect data on wind speeds and build models which they tested in a wind tunnel. But for some building designs, this expensive and time-consuming process has been replaced by faster and cheaper software powered by artificial intelligence. After a decade of research, architectural engineering company Takinaka has developed a typhoon simulation software called Kazumidori.
その用途としては、いくつかあるんですけども、例えば建物や部材に作用する風の力を計算できるためですね、建物の骨組みやガラスの厚さなどの設計に活用しています。その他、建物が風でどのくらい揺れるかといった評価も可能ですので、いくつかの建物形状に対して計算した結果を比較してですね、風に揺れにくい建物をデザインすることが非常に容易になっています。またですね、過去の台風の再現ではなく、今後増加が懸念されるスーパー台風をですね、想定できるため、台風被害のリスク評価に活用することも可能になっています。
For a 3-kilometre square urban area, it usually takes 3 months to build a model, conduct a wind tunnel test, and get the results. But with Takinaka's software, the entire process can happen in just 2 or 3 days, and its engineers are trying to reduce that down to half a day.
計算精度は、空洞実験と同様レベルぐらいになっておりますし、
Japanese architects are also experimenting with unconventional building materials for high-rises. Skyscrapers are usually built from concrete or steel because they're strong and cost-effective. But building from wood is more environmentally friendly. Maeda is going to construct a 13-story wood and steel hybrid office building in Tokyo's Shibuya district. To make the building earthquake-proof, designers came up with a hybrid lattice structure that will support the walls and create a more user-friendly experience.
もともと木造、建物、要は住宅とかなんかは木材で作ってたわけですので、木材を、その耐震要素だとか、台風要素ですね、風に対する要素として使っているというのは、それこそもう何千年も前から行われてたことなので、決してそれ自体は新しくはないです。で、ただ
アピールしたいっていう思いが非常にありました。ただ構造体として使うためにはガラスの外に出してしまうと、やはり雨風でさらされて劣化してしまってどんどん強度が落ちてしまうと問題があるので、ガラスの中に入れて外から見えるようなものにしようというふうに考えました。
These designs and technologies have helped high-rise buildings to withstand typhoons and earthquakes, and now many low-rise buildings in Japan are starting to adopt them as well. Some vulnerabilities still exist, like older buildings constructed before regulations were tightened in 1981. With natural disasters becoming more and more frequent, these innovative designs and technologies could be key to protecting the economy and lives both in Japan and around the world.
Coming up, the new Bauhaus. Europe is pledging billions in its green renewal. But is everyone on the same page? Norman Foster tells us why he's still designing airports. This is Bloomberg Green. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Germany's Bauhaus movement in the early 20th century was immortalized by mass-produced simplicity. It was grounded in the idea of comprehensive artwork, incorporating all aspects of art, design, and construction. And now that Europe is looking to build back better along sustainable lines, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen wants a new movement, but built with the same philosophy.
Every movement has its own look and feel. And we need to give our systemic change its own distinct aesthetics to match style with sustainability. And this is why we will set up a new European Bauhaus, a co-creation space where architects, artists, students, engineers, designers work together to make that happen.
It's not every day that political leaders usher in new aesthetic movements, but in the EU's 2020 State of the Union address, that's exactly what European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen intended. The announcement of the new European Bauhaus came as part of a €750 billion EU recovery fund, intended to help the bloc's economy and aim for a more sustainable future. Taking its name from the early 20th century design movement, the European Commission stressed the interdisciplinary nature of this new European Bauhaus.
There is an emphasis on this idea of thinking across the typical disciplinary boundaries, because what you really need is a whole range of new holistic solutions. By staying only within one vertical, you may not be able to address the kind of holistic thinking and the kind of synergistic solutions that will necessarily be part of addressing the climate crisis with the built environment.
The original Bauhaus movement worked across mediums to transform art into industry. Now, as 40% of our carbon emissions come from the built environment, the new European Bauhaus hopes to put utility and sustainability front and center.
The old European Bauhaus was basically looking at the built environment as a total work of art and saying that what we need to address is this big problem of how do we want to live in our cities. And I think in that sense, it is incredibly relevant. Now we have a new challenge.
The European Bauhaus movement is intended to be a bridge between, on one hand, the world of science and technology, and on the other hand, the world of arts and culture.
In the fall of 2021, the European Commission is calling for at least 5 project proposals to bring to life the concepts of the new European Bauhaus, and with it, they hope, a green architectural revolution.
This is not a movement yet. It's an initiative with a timeline for the next few years. But if this is to become a movement, and I certainly personally hope that this would become a movement, it would need a different mindset. That's a long-term effort, and that would require changes in legislation, changes in practices.
Last year, we opened the cleanest waste-to-energy power plant in the world. That is so clean that today you can climb its facades like a climbing wall, and you can ski Alpine down the roof park. Clean technology is not only the right thing to do, it will also create a much greater quality of life. And on the other hand, making it more desirable to actually address the challenges we're facing.
The goal of the new European Bauhaus movement is that climate consciousness permeates every aspect of design. The problem is not everyone agrees on the direction of travel. In December, Norman Foster pulled out of Architects Declare for his continued work with airports. The group says that architects cannot just carry on with business as usual, but Norman Foster says it's more important to be part of the conversation.
Mobility, air travel, is not going to go away. The reality is we're a mobile society, mobile in terms of movement, information, goods. And that's been a trend over the history of civilization. And air travel, in relative terms, when you compare it with agriculture, is not a huge element in that overall picture. And the need for those buildings, the infrastructure which services the aircraft, those need to be as sustainable as possible. We know also that cheap air travel is not a right. In terms of its carbon footprint, we can, through taxes, adjust that. Also, most importantly, we can create aviation fuel which is fossil-free, and we could do that with clean nuclear energy. You can convert seawater into aviation fuel. The American Navy has already done it. The technology exists. Also, we know that there's a lot of exploration into hydrogen power, into electric power. What we need is to address those issues, not to run away ostrich-like and bury our heads in the sand and make good noises. We need positive action to reduce carbon footprints.
Lord Foster, about 12 years ago, you were talking about sustainability in buildings, and you said that the world would need to get to almost absolute desperation before everyone got their act together. And then you said the question then would be if we had run out of time. 12 years on, do you think the world has become more aware? Are we awake now to the real challenges of climate change?
I think you have to be an optimist, and obviously time is running out, but I think that there are positive signs. I mean, the fact that, for example, we have John Kerry in the American administration, who's a passionate advocate for sustainability and moves against climate change. It's really a collective will to address that with the realization that we could not only, in the process of addressing that, raise the standard of living for 1 in 7 at the moment who don't have access to electrical power, clean water, modern sanitation. And if bold measures are not taken, that will be by 2050, 1 in 3 of humanity. So there is a moral imperative to provide more energy, more power, an abundance of power. Those societies which have more power have greater life expectancy, lower infant mortality, greater freedom, political freedom, academic freedom. So there is powerful reasons to go in that direction.
That does it for this week. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.